In this chapter, we're going to talk about the symmetric Benoni, meaning that, well, when black in a Benoni structure takes on d5, white takes back with the e-pawn. This is, well, quite reasonably known as being a very safe system for white, seen as somewhat unambitious, I would argue. I mean, why wouldn't white take with the c-pawn and then get this broad center we debated in the previous chapter? But while that can be promising at times, it also gives blacks a considerable amount of counterplay. If you look at this position, well, you can only say positive things about the white position, right? White has a spatial advantage, and black, there's really not much counterplay. If you, well, compared to the previous chapter, we thought counterplay would be something like f5 or something like b5. But f5 doesn't hit anything, and b5, we even have a pawn on c4 covering that. So when white chooses to play a4, there's not going to be any kind of b5 either. So this position is mainly characterized by being somewhat sad for black. The author says it's one of his favorite structures, and is even a reason he decided to write this book. And I have to give him credit. He really comes up with some great examples, and my understanding of this symmetric Benoni structure has quite improved by seeing his examples. Generally, I thought that this leads to a drawy structure, white being slightly better, and of course there was examples of white winning now and then, but in general it's an unambitious move. Now I don't think so. I think this is a very dangerous structure for black, and if you're going to play the Benoni as black, try to do it in a way where white is not in time to take back on d5. And it's very interesting also that white has this moderate space advantage, but it seems to be more than enough for really long-term pressure. And also there is this e-file that's open. Typically when there is an open file, that will lead to exchanges, and this favors the defender. But as we will see in this chapter, that's not really the case. So I think it's a somewhat misunderstood structure, and I think the author comes with very good points that makes us understand it better. So yeah, I look forward to going through the examples with you, and I hope you will learn as much as I did from them. We are starting off between a game between two world champions. It's Spassky against Fischer. Not from their famous 72 World Championship match, but for the match in 1992. That is a match, obviously, with a much less mythical reputation. First of all, it's 20 years later. The players are not at their peaks at all. And there is the problem with the venue, there is the problem with Fischer's personality, character, and so on and so forth. Let's not go into that, but to say that actually there was very interesting chess moments in this match. And there was also some, well, model games. And this is game 26, and Spassky just plays a gem of a strategic masterpiece, I would say. Maybe, well, I will explain it along the way, but also going too deeply into details almost feels like ruining it. It's something that should be enjoyed, perhaps like music should be enjoyed. One should just, well, enjoy the harmony and the flow in a way. But some explanations there will be, I'm sorry. Black is threatening to play knight e5, making a fork like this. It's not a threat, but white has the pair of bishops. Why not keep it? So Spassky goes queen to d1. Fischer plays e6, and it's extremely obvious in this game that Spassky doesn't want to complicate it at all. It's not like he doesn't play with ambition. We will see that. But he's trying to keep it extremely clean and just play with his space advantage and not allow any kind of complications. So let's say taking on e6 gives a murky pawn structure. He's not going to do that. He castles. Fischer takes on d5. Sure, you could transpose to the previous chapter and take with the c-pawn. But Spassky doesn't want that. He wants the more simplistic, symmetric Benoni. And while black is very solid and is under much less pressure in the asymmetric Benoni because there is not this pawn avalanche coming to him in the center, white do have a pair of bishops and he do have some kind of space. And these things matters, but we will see that. He goes the move knight to e8. It insinuates the idea of taking on c3. Carlsen has done that in some games. There are many games where they take on c3, and while of course white gets a full pair of bishops, it changes the pawn structure, and it's not necessarily bad for white. But Spassky is saying today I'm not going to allow any kind of counterplay. So bishop d2, a very modest move, just defending this knight on c3. Knight e5 happens, a retreat, f5, and now Spassky starts showing some kind of teeth. He plays f4, pushing the knight back, and then the move g4. But the move g4 should not be misunderstood as an attacking move in the ordinary sense. It's a space-grabbing move. And he just wants to be knight h6. He plays the move king to g2. It's a cozy move. It protects the g3 square, perhaps, so there's no queen h4 counterplay. It also makes sure there's no check on d4. It's just harmony in a way, and after knight c7, he's gonna grab even more space. He plays the move g5, so we see the idea in no way was to try and open the g file. He's space is what this game is about. After knight f7, he plays the move rook to b1. Again, I just love it. It's similar to the move bishop to d2. It's these very small moves nipping any kind of counterplay in the bot. It's obvious. Well, we know from the Benoni, black is going to play a6, try to play b5, and a rook on b8. And Spassky is just countering this already. Fischer puts the rook to e8, and again, it's not like this bishop is massively under attack, but Spassky pushes it out of the way. Rook b8, h4, a6, and now the author says, well, he could have played the move a4, and the computer also quite like it, but Spassky is not afraid of b5. On the contrary, he actually basically encourages white, sort of black, to push on the queen side because he sees no particularly dangers in that. He plays the move queen c2, and after b5, he just protects his structure with b3. He's ready to take back like this. And should you play a move like b4, well, sure, you've closed the queen side, but he's happily going to go in this direction and perhaps put pressure on the f5 pawn with a sacrifice and follow it up like this. So the closure of the queen side is quite to white's advantage. The author mentions that perhaps Fischer should keep it fluid like this, but he says putting the queen on d7 also would help Spassky, let's say something like this. And now suddenly the threat of knight f5 is real, because when we take back on f5, he's going to win h7 as well due to the threat to the queen. And it could very easily end up with, these three strong pawns for a piece that's just going to march forward and win. Fischer chooses to play rook b7, and Spassky gets out of the way in the b file, but I think more he actually wants to trade a pair of rooks. It can sound a bit weird that he wants to trade rooks when there is this massive space advantage for white. But Spassky is very much looking for actually an exchange of all major pieces, and we will see why when we get there. So Fischer obliges. He takes and goes queen b8. It has the idea of counterplay down the b file, eyeing this square. And again, I just love the small moves by Spassky, right? Bishop to c1, just covering the b2 square. If you take, we're gonna take back, and there's no counterplay in the b line. It's not that rook e7 is perhaps a winning threat, but white can definitely start maneuvering while there is just no counterplay. We can also start, let's say, moving this knight to e2 because we have these two pieces actually defending backwards. So all the relevant squares in the b files is protected. Fischer realizes this and he goes to move queen to d8. Spassky starts rerouting the knight to e2. It's aiming the g3 square with a potential sacrifice at f5 at some point. Fischer doesn't want to defend extremely passively, so he opens the b file. It feels very logical, but we will see it leads to his downfall eventually. He goes knight e8, h5 happens, rook to e7, very logical to create a bit of pressure with a pin here. And Spassky's next move, I find great. The author says, You could also play rook h1, something like this, rook b7, and then the idea of knight to g1, to f3, to h4, and actually to play for an attack. But Spassky doesn't want to have any kind of complications. I understand he's not young at the time, but it's more, I think, an interesting understanding of chess. Spassky is fully aware that he's strategically better, and he just chooses to not allow any kind of counterplay. You could see perhaps the same thing in Ulf Andersen's style, that it's not cowardice. Of course, you could argue there's a bit of that, but it's more this complete level of control. And h6, I think it's a beautiful move. Sure, it gives up this kind of tension, but it grabs even more space. And there is this confidence in that my space advantage and my pair of bishops, it's going to be enough to win. And no, this idea of not allowing any kind of complications, but still heavily playing for a win, I find beautiful. You could, of course, step out of the diagonal with bishop f8, but after bishop b2, it's not like there is direct mate on h8 because we have the knight defending it, but it's going to be very unpleasant in the long run. So Fischer goes back to h8 instead, but now he's facing the problem that, well, this bishop is really going to lack squares. There's still the d4 squares, you can argue the a1 square as well. Bishop d2 happens, rook b7. And there is the threat of rook to b2. Spassky counters this with rook b1. And I would guess Fischer's idea is after queen b8, he thought, okay, I'm gonna exchange rooks and queens. This is enough to draw. But Spassky sees it differently. And the computer starts again suggesting moves like, let's say, rook b3 to try and improve your pawn structure. But the general theme is that Spassky thinks, no, I have enough to win. Let me exchange off pieces that are not crucial for my advantage. So he allows an exchange here. He can just go knight g3, and then we get this position. And this is just winning for white, simply. You can argue the pair of bishop matters a bit, but it's mainly that the king is now going to go to the a4 square. And then there is the threat of getting in this direction. This is possible for black to defend, but only by giving up the control of the king side, which means that this pawn structure eventually going to succumb to some kind of sacrifice. And it takes a while. I mean, basically you can say that Spassky at move 10 said, yeah, I'm going to retreat my pieces and I'm going to win with my sort of space advantage. And that's exactly what happens. It takes a while, but there has been no hurry, but also no problems at all for Spassky in his strategy, right? Fischer puts the bishop on b2, but it doesn't really matter much. The author mentions now there is this sacrifice on f5, but, well, Spassky has stayed so loyal to this idea of not complicating in any way, and he's not going to change that concept now at all. So king to e2, knight h8. They do like this, and the king is coming in this direction, finally. Now bishop f2 happens, and, well, the next move the author gives... he says it's dubious. I just love it. Sure, knight f5 wins, but let's not care about tactical details. Spassky plays the move knight to h1. It's impossible for me not to love it. What I really love is that, sure, this knight is as out of play as it gets. It's stuck, but it doesn't matter. I mean, yes, it's stuck on h1, but it also keeps this bishop out. So basically there is, I mean, we can see this bishop on d2 covers the e1 square. So you can make the argument the bishop on h4 is as trapped as the knight on h1. And the knight on h1 basically controls this bishop. Sure, in theory we need to keep our bishop on d2 or on c3, but we're kind of happy with that. It looks so odd, but I mean, Spassky playing like this, it takes, I mean, in my opinion, this takes guts. Sacrificing on f5, that's kind of trivial. That's just wins, right? This is really playing for beauty. So the king goes to a4, knight c7, and the king is going to enter like this. Black's position is still solid. We can see that you can't just go and win the d6 pawn because knight is going to come to f7. So bishop c2, knight to f7, bishop to a4, king b8, bishop to d7, knight to d8, And now, after bishop c3, the author says it's a complete zugzwang. The problem is that, well, as you said, this bishop is out of play. This bishop, sort of knight, needs to defend the pawn on a6, which generally means the only piece that can, and the king needs to defend this knight. So the only piece that can actually move is this one. But if you put it on f7 or on b7, let's say knight b7, you can play the move bishop to e6, and the bishop is going to go to g8 and starts collecting everything here. And if you take, it's just going to be a deadly passed pawn like this, and the king entering here. So it's really game over. So yeah, I think knight a8 was played, but then Spassky picked up a pawn, and he basically zigzagged his way back, and well, now like this, and eventually taking on g6 and taking on d8. He had to calculate a little bit, but it also resulted in Fischer resigning this game. Well, I mean, one could delve into all the details, but I think it's basically something that should be enjoyed, because this is a classic game of chess. And while we all see Fischer as the huge hero and the by far strongest player in the 72 match, that is true, and so was he in 92. But Spassky is also a very, very strong world champion. He won, I think, 2 world championship matches. I mean, just because of this fifth Fischer myth, Spassky gets a little bit downgraded by history. He's, I agree, Fischer was a stronger player than him. We saw that in 92. But Spassky is also a very serious entity with strong creativity and this amazing feeling of positional chess. I cannot add much. I mean, from this position, he basically just completely outplays Fischer in a model game. I mean, well, to talk about the highlights, the whole game is a highlight. It's chess harmony, it's chess understanding as its best. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. We're gonna continue with a very impressive example of how white should play in this position. But the author is, I wouldn't say cheating, but a little bit. He's using quite a huge part of the game Malakhov against Grishuk. But Malakhov spoils his position at some point, and then the author just starts to more or less imagine how the game should have continued from there. I like it because he creates a very instructive game, but it's also a funny way of doing it. But I think authors should have quite some freedom and creativity to get the points out they want, and I think it's a very instructive game. So let's get started with it. Grishuk has just played the move knight to d7, and he wants to jump to the e5 square, where he sort of forks the bishop and pawn. I mean, fork is a way too strong a word, but it means that if white doesn't do anything about this, black is going to get the pair of bishops, and white doesn't want that. So he plays the move f4. It can look very ugly, right? It's, I mean, this pawn is really blocking the mobility of both this bishop and knight, and it looks close to a beginner's move. But very much because of this symmetric Benoni structure, this creates this kind of very slow maneuvering games. And here actually it's a very useful move because, well, it simply stops this knight e5 maneuver. And White's perspective, sort of White's plan is so long-term anyway that this kind of immediate things doesn't seem to matter that much. The knight on e2 and the bishop on d2, they will be good pieces, but they're going to be it later. There's no hurry. The author mentions that now Grishuk did have the chance to do something interesting. He would play the move queen to h4 check. So white goes g3, and then the idea is bishop takes c3. Well, the obvious point is you can't take like this, because then we win a pawn with queen takes g3. And, of course, the more relevant point is that after bc3, queen e7, we get this weird double pawn structure. But this is actually quite an achievement for black, the author thinks, and I generally agree, because it changes the dynamics of the game. Now it's white has to start attacking, and it's possible he will, but black has considerable amount of counterplay. This is a normal position for black. But he also mentions that after bishop takes c3, there is this very interesting move, king to f1. It basically exploits that there is the threat to h4, but we can play knight takes c3 next move. So if he just retreats, we get our pair of bishops, and, well, we don't have to cripple our pawn structure. The author mentions the interesting move bishop takes b2. His idea is that in something like this, there is compensation for the queen, although the computer says not enough. But the author also mentioned that bishop takes b2, trying to play for compensation in the long diagonal, is pretty promising for white, and that is also true. So queen takes queen h4 check, an interesting move, but not that great after all. Grisha plays f5, just countering sort of the space grab for white. Castling's rook to e8. It covers the e3 square, but as we saw with Spassky, this small move bishop d2 is very useful, and white is not trying to be sort of fully developed, or I would say strategically developed in the short term. He has a lot of time. Generally, in this symmetric Benoni, a huge feature is that the price of one move doesn't matter a lot. We will see here that white can really take his time regrouping. So knight a6 happens. I mean, you could argue, oh, is he threatening knight b4? But Malakoff, no problem. It's knight b4. He will just put the bishop back to b1 and play a3 later. So white's position is incredibly solid. There's going to be quite some maneuvering. Now knight f6, knight g3. And we see, like Spassky, no worries at all about exchanging major pieces because, well, this kind of specific pawn structure, due to the space advantage, even when heavy pieces are exchanged, white still has considerable chances. Not much happens the next game, so we're just going to skip them a little bit quickly. Don't pay too much attention to details. I thought here it's interesting to note that white plays the move knight f1, and it again gives away that time is really not of essence. It's more that, well, you can take whatever time you want to improve the position of your pieces. It's a very slow way. I mean, on g3, the knight was not doing a lot of useful stuff. It was mainly, I mean, passively defending the e4 square, but there's a lot of pieces capable of doing that now. So why not improve this one by playing knight f1? And like this, he has managed to get the knight to f3. Not a major achievement, but still it looks more harmonious there. It's like there is so many small stages in the white regrouping, but we will see that it's gonna get there at some point. In this position, the author mentions that, well, black could play the b5 and then he's move b5, and he starts analyzing a lot of exchanges on b5, and that position is probably quite playable for black. The computer says that why don't you just play like Spassky, just keeping the structure intact and not worrying too much about counterplay in the b file, because it's not that realistic, and we could even exchange rooks like that. The computer says quite some advantage for white still. So the game continues like this. Another set of exchanges of rooks, knight e2, and now he plays the move b5. The author mentions maybe he should have played the move a5 instead, and that generally seals the queen side, meaning only the king side is left for white to push for an advantage. I think it's one of these typical things that if one player, I mean, has to choose between two plans, he chooses one of them, it goes wrong. It's extremely tempting to say, why didn't you play a5 instead? Let's imagine he played the move a5 and had lost. We would say maybe he should have tried b5 instead. I don't think there's any kind of particularly objective reason one move is better than the other. It's a somewhat sad situation for black. After the move b5, the queen side is about to open up, would generally favor black. But Malakoff has positioned himself in a way that he's able to get his queen active first. And that's somehow compensated for the space gained by black, I would say. It's clever play by Malakoff that he understands that b5 I cannot prevent, but at least I can make sure that circumstances are going to be somewhat favorable for me. Grisha grabs space, and Malakoff then starts going I mean, it's not gonna, well, transposing into the Fischer game becomes too strange. And also it should be called the Spassky game because it was Spassky who played brilliantly, actually. But he's trying to play for g4, grabbing more space. And after knight g7, g4, well, we can see his position has quite improved. The author mentions that you could make a positional argument for something like this, because in this position, well, it looks like black has grabbed some kind of control of the f5 square, but in reality, there is only this piece sort of competing for it, while white can, well, maybe put a knight to g3, or, I mean, it seems like there is, for black to start playing for things like that is not really, well, that his position is not ready to start unbalancing. He should play for solidity, and that's what Grishuk is doing. So queen e7 happened, knight to f3, queen d7, and g5. Again, a bit like Spassky, more focused on grabbing space rather than opening lines. And the author mentions that, well, you should really not play the move hg5 in this position, because let's say the game continues like this. Now white has gained access to the f4 square. So Grishuk stays solid like this. Now, unfortunately, Malakhov was too afraid of keeping the position close, so he took an h6 and actually ended up losing the game. So, I mean, at this stage, the author just takes control of both sides and starts imagining how the game could have continued. He says that queen to a1 would be a logical continuation. And, well, he goes on, let's say king h7, defending the pawn on h6, knight g3, bishop f7. And he debates if h4, h5. Is this just a fortress from black's perspective? And his point is, he doesn't think so. He thinks white still has a very meaningful advantage in this position. And, well, the A file, of course, helps. It's not like it's going to be decisive, but it's there. And if if black puts all his attention to defending on the king side, perhaps something bad would happen to him there. But first of all, white is going to regroup his bishop. So bishop e3, bishop e7, there's a solid move like king f2. And he says the bishop goes over here. I think it's obvious that while black is solid, there's absolutely no fun in this position. It's white who has chances. Okay, now he starts imagining how things could develop. He regroups the knight to e3, so there is as much firepower as possible towards this f5 pawn. And, well, queen b1 like this, he says, he imagines a game continuing with a sacrifice like that. His point is that next we're going to go knight e4, and if you go bishop g7, I can exchange like this. Now knight f5 check is a threat. And if bishop g6, f5, queen f7, trying to utilize the pin, you can just go away. And he basically finishes his imaginary game like this. I don't know what we should make of that. It's beautiful. But in general, I thought it was an interesting model game. And while the Spassky model game was, I would say, so clean, what we saw here was a much smaller space advantage for white actually be sort of nurtured and grow very, very slowly. I mean, we had to jump to move 34 because before he got g4 and started to gain space. And I thought also, well, this idea of keeping the queen on a5 was rather clever. So I think a very interesting model game. And while sure, Malakhov went wrong and Grishuk actually won the game, I think the author managed to prove that Malakhov was afraid of closing the position too much, but white keep an interesting edge there. So I think another interesting model game, and I think a great game because the first one we saw a very pure version where Spassky had a huge advantage from the beginning. Here we saw how Malakhov would build it gradually, and while black definitely having better chances than Fischer, still was under considerable pressure. But I find it mainly fascinating how slow the nature is of this. I mean, it seems like things start to culminating around move 50 or something like this. So I hope you enjoyed this example. It was a little bit weird, but I think it was actually cool that the author started analyzing instead of just following what actually happened in the game. And I think by that we'll sort of learn that even a position like this, with everything being closed, is still very, very unpleasant for black. So far, not much fun for black in this symmetric Benonis, to put it mildly. Our next game is Morovic against Lodi, and I thought I would start it quite early, actually, to try to explain how this symmetric Benoni positions arises in a practical game. Because, well, quite often in a sort of black plays the Benoni, not given white the choice of doing this. They will play, well, with a very early take on d5. But here we see a King's Indian position where black now has played the move e6. And by playing a delayed Benoni, it gives whites the option of, when black takes, to take back with the pawn. The relevant question for white a bit is what to do with the bishop on f1. Morovic puts it on e2, but actually the more common move is to move bishop to d3. So black takes on d5. Sure, white can play takes d5. It becomes a normal Benoni position, nothing wrong with that. But our subject is taking with the pawn like this. And here, there's a reason Morovic played the move bishop to e2, because rook e8 check looks just strong for black, right? The idea is that after bishop e3, it's possible to play the move bishop to h6, and it looks like white has an immediate problem. But actually, it's kind of a deceptive position, because white can just castle. And after bishop e3, fe3, there is this backward pawns indeed, and even black has control over the e5 square. But white is still quite better here. I mean, for instance, if you actually take the pawn, then after queen d2, and let's say the rook retreats, something like knight g5 creates a huge attack down the f line. And I don't think the black position is sort of ready to cope with that. So rook takes e3 is considered a mistake. But even in this position, let's say queen e7, e4, knight to d7, white plays the move queen to d2. And while the black position looks good from a positional perspective, it's actually very hard to do anything with it. White wants to follow, let's say, rook f2, rook to f1, if he's given the amount of time by black just stalling. So the logical move looks like knight to e5, but after takes, again, if black is given the time, let's say, to play queen e7, knight d7 to e5, he's going to have a nice position. But white has this cool move queen to f4, and he's actually better here. This creates some discomfort in the f-file. And let's say if you exchange queens, in general it looks nice, but this knight is under attack. And the problem is that if you start doing something like knight to d7, there is the move knight to b5, and the pawn on d6 is kind of going to drop. The same in this position. I think if you go king g7, white can start considering moves like knight to b5, and again this pawn on d6 becomes weak. So the move on the check in this position, bishop d3, is actually quite reasonable. After takes, rook e8 check, bishop to e3, the very creative player Morozovic has sacrificed the exchange in this position. And now he just wants to, well, he's basically saying he would rather want to have a bishop on g7 than a rook on e8. And he wants to go knight d7, knight to e8 next, and then take control of the e5 square. It is a very interesting concept, but still an exchange is an exchange. Anyway, this was quite a detour. Morovic plays the move bishop to e2. And after e5, he takes back with the pawn. Now the next move is quite criticized by the author. And I would say rightly so, but the alternatives are not that fascinating either. He suggests rook e8 as a better move, but, well, castles, knight e4, takes, bishop d3, rook e8, bishop to g5, he says is slightly worse for black. When I was playing this in my youth, I was sort of, let's say, playing something like queen b6 for black and perhaps knight d7 next. But it's a very sad position. White will start to try doing something in the e-file, and the computer says it's almost like +1 for white. So this is kind of sad. What the computer prefers is in this position to play the move bishop to f5. But actually here, well, the book mentions the move g4 and says that after bishop e4, even a move like castles, white is quite better here. Probably due to a threat of, let's say, something like g5, it's better to take on f3, and we get a position like this. It perhaps reminds us a little bit of the previous games, even, let's say, what Spassky was doing. And we know by now that while these pawns can look a little bit weak, they're also grabbing space, and that this can end up in a pretty sad way for black. Having said that, after bishop f5, I noticed that, well, modern computers suggest castling, and the idea is after knight d4, which is generally supposed to be an ideal way for black to try and exchange things. The computer thinks knight b1 is a great move. I mean, nothing shocks you anymore in this kind of modern days, but it basically wants to follow up with bishop d3, queen c2. If knight a6, it's gonna go a3 to stop the knight coming to b4. And it's basically arguing that this constellation is not fully stable. With a bishop on d3, we start threatening g4, maybe we can play rook e1, and eventually we're gonna push black back. Yeah, I'm sorry to say, but the computer thinks white is quite better after the move knight to b1. Well, let's put it this way. If this position is good for white, then the symmetric Benoni is pretty good for white in general. And we will see in the game, after knight b to d7, it becomes very, very nice for white. White castles, black goes a6, and now bishop f4 is a nice way to exploit that the knight is gone to d7, because we're just threatening to take the pawn like this, right? So black has to start defending, queen c7, and we go queen to d2. And, well, white just has very simple play here. Well, he will go rook fe1 and bishop d3 next. The author suggests that perhaps black should try to go knight e8 with counterplay. Well, he wants to play knight to e5, and let's say white takes it, he'll take back with the pawn and put a knight on d6. I'm not saying it's great, but it's a plan at least. But the author suggests that now you can even go rook a d1, and his point is after knight to e5, then this unusual move actually taking with the bishop. But the idea is that, sure, we give away a pair of bishops, but after d5, d6 is incredibly strong. Well, something like queen d7, else we will play d7 ourselves, just rook fe1, bishop goes away, this one is under attack. I think black is close to being lost here. So after queen d2, the game was rook e8, rook fe1, knight to b6. I can understand that knight b6 looks weird, but you have to develop in some kind of way. And I think knight b6 is getting the knight out of the way. You could also get it out of the way on f8, but let's say bishop d3, it more or less becomes the same thing, that black has to do something like bishop d7, which is extremely passive. And like we will see in the game, this maneuver targeting the d6 pawn, well, it even gains in strength here most likely. It's just a very sad position for black. A typical move would be knight to e4, but this is also very badly timed. You will take and go bishop d3, and after this rook exchange, there's already a threat of a check on e8. And I think the author mentions something like perhaps knight e5, knight e5, d5, bishop to e3. Maybe this is the best black can get, but it's a very sad position in general. You will have a sort of potential of a pass pawn like this, and there will also be undermining moves like b4. Sure, maybe black can draw this, but to play this voluntarily makes very little sense. So after rook fe1, let's go back to the game. Knight b6 happened, bishop d3, bishop d7. And, well, it's possible for black to make this kind of argument that, sure, white has a bit of extra space, but that's it. And we're going to start exchanging things in the E-line, and we don't have any particular weaknesses. But we have already seen two examples of that this, while in general it looks like a smaller space advantage, here actually it seems to become quite suffocating in the long run. In this example, actually, it becomes much more short term, because white plays the move knight to g5, And this starts eyeing the weakness on d6. And we'll see it in the game. The game goes rook e1 exchange and rook to e8. And now, after knight to e4, well, the pawn is basically just hanging there. White can make black makes an exchange and goes to move knight to c8. And, I mean, this is a sad position. If white plays it passively, sort of slowly, it's still going to be quite unpleasant for black. But there is also, well, as we'll see in the game, actually the white position has immediate potential. After the move bishop to g5, we see the f6 square is basically uncovered, you cannot cover it in a natural way for black. And, well, no, it feels a little bit unusual that a moderate space advantage like this actually leads to a crushing position for white. But there seems to be, I don't know how to phrase it fully, but it seems like there's not enough space for black to maneuver on the back ranks, right? I mean, let's say we spoke about headshot positions. You could make the argument that white has even more space there than here. But there somehow black can have a more fluid development in his confined space. Here, it seems to be very hard to create harmony. And of course, in this position, there is a major weakness as well. Black now had to play a move like f5 because, well, if you allow knight f6 check, well, it becomes basically mating patterns, right? So, well, the author suggests king h8. Maybe now after knight f6 you don't have to take it, but he suggests perhaps the move bishop to f6, and we start having a threat of taking on g7, going queen c3 next. It's more or less a disaster for black. So he played the move f5. And after knight f6 takes, king f7, bishop to g5. Yeah, again, you can make this continuous case that black is solid, and is it really that bad? But yeah, it seems to be that bad. Now he goes bishop h6, starts eyeing an attack towards the g7 square. Black tries to get the queen back. There is an exchange and bishop to g5. And, well, now the f6 square basically becomes difficult to defend. He plays the move queen to a5 first. It threatens the pawn on a6. And after queen to b7, there is queen d8. And now there's nothing stopping the queen coming to f6 next with decisive effect. So the game finishes something like this. And it takes, bishop takes b5. And like this, well, there is mate on the dark squares. I think the last bits had no particularly relevance, but well, it was such a short game compared to the others, so why not give you a full one? I don't know what to conclude else here than Symmetric Benoni is pretty unpleasant for black. Well, we saw another example of as soon as the position becomes well, slow, or I wouldn't say slow, but something like this, right? That things develop normally, but black doesn't have any kind of particular target or plans. It becomes very unpleasant for black. So a general symmetric Benoni seems unpleasant for black, but we saw even here that the moves that are supposed to be quite decent, like rook e8, leads to this position that is not pleasant, or even worse. I mean, the strongest impression on me is this move knight to b1. Not because it feels like, well, knight b1 is an amazing move, something you should aim for, but the whole idea that this position is still better for white according to the computer, and not just a bit, but actually quite pleasant for white. If this is great for white, I mean, Symmetric Benoni is pretty unpleasant for black. So, yeah, another sad example for black, and I think we get to start, well, to really feel that there is a reason why white goes for Symmetric Benoni, and also why black is very careful to allow it. The final game in this chapter is Magnus Carlsen against Luc van Vele from Weigand-Zee, and the two of them have sort of a beautiful rivalry during Weigand-Zee. Of course, in a chess sense, well, Carlsen is too strong for Van Vele, which is reasonable. But on the football field, there's this amazing tradition that on the first free day, there will be Team Magnus against Team Van Wely, and we will play. And we will go to a local stadium, and we will play with, I think, a second league Dutch team where the sort of players will supplement teams of chess players. And Van Wely and Magnus will choose their chess playing sort of teammates, but I will always end up on Team Magnus because he's probably too afraid I would injure him, and that would also be not too good, right? This game is from 2013, so it's also just before I became Magnus's full-time coach. Actually, this was my last tournament as Vichy's coach. I would change to Magnus a few weeks later, so there is some nostalgia there. But as I said, Carlsen Van Wely in chess has been pretty once sort of one-way traffic. But having said that, Van Wely is this cool character that, while being, sub-world elite, and he was in top 10 at some point, he never sort of backed down from challenges. I mean, you have seen him in Weigand say lose games to Kasparov in the Najdorf, and you will also see him to lose to Magnus. And he's basically this very principled character that sort of thinks that there's nothing wrong than being worse than these players, but I will do my best in a competitive sense, but also I'll stay loyal to myself and just play my own kind of chess. And that has led to a lot of instructive losses, and we will see one of them here. But one has to respect it, and there has also been the ups, but, well, not in this game. Anyway, it's some kind of, King's Indian, and we have our usual center like this. And Van Wely just played the move queen to b6. It's quite a theoretical position, actually, and what Magnus does is sort of the common move at the time. These days, due to computers, the line has evolved a little bit, and, believe it or not, the main move by the computer is to do long castling here. If I start explaining it in sort of common sense, I would suggest that, the king looks a little bit risky here, but apparently White's attack on the king side seems to be quicker than the black on the queen side, right? And, the nice thing with space is that space also means there is less room for your opponent to attack, right? And somehow White seems to be doing pretty well in this position. I think rook e8, and then bishop d3 says the computer, covering the e4 square, and White is pleasantly better here. But that's a little bit of an addendum. Magnus played the normal move, knight to f3, and Van Wely, if you just play normal strategy, playing sort of reasonable moves, I mean, White is just going to be better. We really want to castle and get everything on the sort of control. Let's say something like rook e8. I assume we castle, and White, I mean, it's just going to end up nice if we get to play h3 and bishop d3, and there's nothing much happening from Black's perspective. Sure, you can try knight e4, but, the usual thing, we're going to push your rook back, we're going to take the e-file. We have seen examples of this turning out badly for Black, and the same would very much happen here. So Van Wely does the move bishop to f5, and now the idea is that, if you castle, knight e4, the circumstances are pretty good for Black in terms of it's actually very hard to defend the b2 pawn now, right? So because, we can't go rook b1 because of the bishop on e4. So here, Black is aware of the symmetric Benoni being a problem, but he has this very specific idea of counterplay in mind. Magnus reacts with knight h4, which is also the theoretical move, simply trying to dislodge this bishop, hoping it goes back, and then we can sort of return to normality, and normality meaning things are great for White. Van Wely reacted by playing the move knight to e4. The author mentions the move bishop g4 also exists, and his argument is that, if you take on f6 like this, takes, bishop takes g4, h4 is hanging. So because of that, he says, it's actually possible to take on g6. And let's say take back, we win a pawn like this, and he says there's not enough compensation for the pawn. That is true to some extent, but I just found it very interesting that in this position, the computer says, sure, we can win a pawn, but I don't like that you get some compensation. I actually think that keeping the position somewhat normal, just by playing f3 And when your bishop goes back, I'm just going to castle. The computer thinks this is a bigger advantage than this sort of extra pawn I showed you before. And this, I think, it's such a testament to how unpleasant this sort of Benoni structure, the symmetric Benoni structure, is from Black's perspective. That the computer actually prefers a normalized position rather than to have an extra pawn with some compensation for Black. So anyway, in this position, Van Wely goes knight e4. And we get this position. Now, well, the problem I mentioned before about the b2 pawn hanging, it's even a bigger threat than, with castling. There's no way to protect the pawn on b2. But white has the tactical move f3. And now this bishop on e4 is basically trapped there. Anyway, it's not trapped in the sense that Black loses a piece, but it's trapped in the sense that it has to back down to f5 and we can take it. Van Wely quite logically takes on b2, but that pretty much leads to his downfall. The correct move in this position is h6. And, well, it's a typical tactical thing, right? That, something is happening in the center, but Black flicks in a threat on the other side. The tactical justification is weird. White can take on h6, Black takes back, and now you take on b2, and White can castle. And if Black starts playing common sense chess, let's say taking on e2, we take on e4, and the white attack is actually winning. We're threatening to take on g6, and let's say if you go queen takes e4, there is knight f5, threatening mate on g7. If you take, you can give a check and rook f4 in a very typical fashion, rook h4. Is threatening mate, and the queen is hanging, so white is just winning a queen and is easily winning here. In this position, there is this magic move, bishop to c2. Computer says this is fine, and the point is that, let's say you go rook a to c1, this bishop looks basically dead, but after rook e2, rook e8, queen to d2, there is queen f6. Sort of clearing this pin, and at the same time threatening on h4. And when you defend the knight, Black can go bishop a4 and survive. I mean, basically dark magic, right? This has relevance from a theoretical point of view, but from our understanding of structure, it matters less. So f3 happened, and Van Wely took on b2. Magnus went rook to b1, and the game was bishop to f5. And Magnus just exchanged on f5, took on b2, and played the move rook to b1. So white gives a check, and then king to d1. And basically, this is a lost position for Black. There is the threat of the pawn hanging on b7 due to the rook. But if you start defending it, well, the author says probably rook b3 first, kicking this bishop, and when it goes somewhere, let's say bishop to d4, we play bishop e7 and we pick up this pawn. He says the only thing is after b6, if you do it immediately, there is this nice trick knight to c6, and you can't take on c6 because of rook a d8 with counterplay like this. But that's more or less the only thing. He says if you go rook b3, you are more or less picking up the d6 pawn, and you're going to win trivially. I think the main thing is that when the bishop is taken on d6, there is this intermezzo of rook d3 just covering, and that's why you interpolate rook b3 now. So after king d1, the game was rook e8, Magnus took on b7, and knight to a6, and, well, the knight is threatening to go to b4, Magnus plays a3. It becomes a nice Magnus game, and, why not see a few more moves, but white is basically winning here. It's worth pointing out that this pawn on f5, it's not a weak extra pawn, it's a weak pawn. I mean, material is equal at the moment. Rook b8 happened, Magnus took it, Van Wely took back with the knight. I guess if you take it with the rook, you can just play the move, maybe bishop d3 first, followed by king c2, or maybe, well, I guess you just play bishop d3. You could even put the bishop back to c1. There's not going to be any entry squares with the rook in the b file. So he took with the knight, bishop d3, rerouted the knight to d7. But, well, Magnus does things in a very Magnus fashion. First he kicks out the bishop. Then he plays rook to b1. It threatens to enter somewhere on b7. If you go rook b8, we are just going to exchange, and well, we can take on f5 next. It's just an extra pawn. Van Velde tries creating a bit of tension so that if you take on f5, c4 would be hanging, but Magnus attacks the weak d6 pawn, bishop e5, rook e1 with a pin. If king g7 happened, bishop g3, this threatens f4. He has to go rook e7, but well, Magnus plays f4, exchanges, and now, well, he has to solve this problem of c4 hanging before he takes on f5. But Magnus just goes bishop e1, h5, g3, and after bishop f6, king b3, king g6, protecting the pawn. He played the move h3, and there's nothing stopping g4 next with well, the f5 pawn hanging, and with the king defending the pawn on c4, it's a trivial win for white. So, well, this phase of the game is more, I mean, Team Carlsen mocking Team Van Velde a little bit, and getting ready for the next football match. But I would say, of the interesting points, I thought that yeah, that long castle is a great move here. It was news to me. I assume it would be for you as well. But apparently the symmetric Benoni is good in a number of ways. Then I think it's relevant to understand here that white is threatening to be much better positionally. So we see black actually going to great length to create relevant counterplay immediately. And it kind of works for black here, but Van Velde played it in an unfortunate move order and lost. So yeah, I think a nice way to round off this chapter. And yeah, well, I'm sorry, Luke, but yeah, looking forward to see you at the football pitch next time. Bye.